Well, I guess for this next one, you better put your seatbelts on. After 30 years of observation from the air, Tim Armstrong shares his knowledge and commentary about the annual spring thaw on Lake of the Woods. Please, God, let it happen soon. Here's Tim Armstrong.
Hi there. I'd like to start by breathing heavily through my nose so we can find out how that works. They have an excellent sound system here anyway. I'm Tim Armstrong. I operate a website that tracks the spring thaw on Lake of the Woods. I use aerial photography, satellite imagery, and increasingly community science to help people understand how it's going each year. This picture was taken about 1 minute after takeoff from the Kenora Airport. And the most relevant thing you'll notice is that Rat Portage Bay on the left is frozen and the Safety Bay on the right is not. Lake of the Woods Ice Patrol went online in 2014. But as a local pilot, I began monitoring the lake ice decades before that. And today, I'll tell you a bit about how those flights evolved into a website and some of what I've learned. This is one of the planes I flew. It's a Beechcraft King Air 200. It cruises at about 500 kilometers an hour, so it can take you from here to Red Lake in 25 minutes. It's mostly flown at altitudes between 10 and 25,000 feet. It's pressurized, and it has lots of fancy equipment for instrument flying. However, in the spring of 1990, my wife, Caroline, was working at Bigger's restaurant in the Kenresha Hotel. Brian and Linda Bigger asked me if I could fly over and take a look at their new camp on Treaty Island. They were eager to reach it, but both water routes to it were blocked by ice in the last stretch. It was easy for me to swing out over the lake as I approached the airport to land. So I would simply tell them what I saw. Then, in 2003, I bought my first digital camera. This is what the 2-megapixel images looked like. Even so, it illustrates the problem. Now, it's hard for me to see this from the angle. Whoops, especially if I push the wrong button. Linda's camp was around here somewhere, and this ice road runs right in front of it. So the first thing I learned about lake ice was that the ice roads are the last to go. They're routed where the current is slow to begin with, and the ice is strong. And then plowing the snow off them causes the ice to thicken even more. So at first, it was just verbal reports and sometimes show them the digital pictures on the tiny little viewfinder on this rather poor camera. But a few years later, my wife Caroline was working at the Best Western, and she would talk to people that came to stay in the hotel before moving out onto the lake. And she told Dave and Ann Johnson, who have a place on Middle Island, about my aerial photography. So I started swinging past Scotty Island to email them pictures of Middle Island. And slowly, word began to spread. Dave and Ann told some of their lake neighbors. Pretty soon, I was trying to email pictures to nearly a dozen people. Now, this was when internet was dial-up, and uploading even tiny photographs took a long time. But I carried on that way for a few years. And during this time, I formed a few notions about what was going on. Near Kenora, we have a fairly persistent pattern. Ice increases in depth until sometime in March, often peaking at about 1 meter thick. But at the same time, open water is beginning to spread in areas with strong current. And that's why there was that difference on the first slide between the appearance of Rat Portage Bay, which is covered in ice roads, and Safety Bay, which has a strong current into the headwaters. The headwaters of the Winnipeg River open early, followed by Safety Bay and Keewatin Channel. And the small patch of water in Devil's Gap, which was more relevant to Linda's camp, expands more slowly. This is Safety Bay, which comprises most of the waterfront from Keewatin to Kenora Bay. And every year I hear from somebody that has said, oh, I drove over the Keewatin Bridge, the lake's open. Well, it's not like that. Just because the view from the Keewatin Bridge is mostly clear of ice does not mean the lake is open. But it does mean the process is starting. So I usually keep an eye on this stretch of water, and when Safety Bay is open from shore to shore, that's when I would start taking pictures. In 2014, I had an epiphany. Instead of struggling with the limitations of email, I should turn my ice patrol into a weblog. I already had some experience blogging vacation road trips for friends. And I knew that you could easily combine pictures with paragraphs of text. So the biggest question was whether a blog host would allow the large number of pictures I would need to post. And it turns out that WordPress allows a very generous amount of storage for pictures, even on their free accounts. Best of all, a blog is part of the internet, a website. Anyone would be able to access it, even if they didn't know me. I thought I might reach as many as 100 people. I was in for a shock. The spring of 2014 was terrible. A lot of people were trying to find information on the thaw, because it looked as if even the May-long weekend might be in jeopardy. Fishing lodges were running out of time to open camp. Marinas were bombarded with callers wanting to know why their boat wasn't in the water yet. Americans and snowbirds weren't sure if they should head north. Fishers and vacationers were worried that they might have to cancel their plans. And search engines sent them to me. In April and May of 2014, its first spring, my little blog was viewed over 60,000 times. That's over 1,000 hits a day. Apparently, I was reaching rather more than 100 people. This picture is from 2017. I had a smartphone by then with a much better camera. This shows Big Stone Bay in the foreground. So this is Big Stone Bay here, and this is Hay Island and Middle Island, where Dave and Ann hang out, and Scotty Island, where the beach is in this little curved bay here. And this is Keewatin Channel and Second Channel and so on. The barrier islands are visible further back, back in the distance here. And the barrier islands are significant because they're a bottleneck across the lake, and also, apart from the fact that the elbow opens up with current, some of the last ice on the lake persists just south of those islands on the far side in this photograph. And way off in the distance in this picture is Shoal Lake, which is the white streak at the back. And it's frozen, and that's kind of normal. Shoal Lake tends to last a few days past Lake of the Woods, retaining the last of the ice. Recently, and especially since the pandemic forced me to retire, I've been getting photographs from other pilots. Josh Broughton is a regular contributor. He lives on the American side of the lake. He likes to climb up to about 10,000 feet in a Cub, so that's an operation in patience, so that he can see more of the lake. And this shot of his, of Kenora, clearly shows the open water in Safety Bay and Keewatin Channel, back here. But notice the strong ice roads in the foreground. So what I would do at first was I would compare what I was seeing this spring to what I'd seen in springs past. And because I'd been doing it, or taking pictures at least, since 2003, it got to be a bit of a headache to remember, what was that year when this part of the lake opened up really early? So as I started to accumulate data, I could compare to other years. And in this way, I could at least say, are we on track for an early spring or a late one? And to keep things straight, I began to compile graphs. This is the brick graph. Each year, I lay another brick on the wall. I don't always know the exact day the ice was entirely gone. It might have been cloudy that day and I couldn't photograph, or it might have happened on a day I wasn't flying at all. So the graph gives the approximate date. I use 5-day periods as marked across the bottom of this calendar-like display. And I use this graph as a guide to my photographs. If I think we're having an early thaw, ominous head shaking, I'll go back and I'll look at my pictures from 2010 or 2012 in the early end of the scale. And if it looks like progress is slow, I'll look at pictures from 2014 and hopefully say we're doing a little better. And you can do the same thing yourself on icepatrol.ca. There's an archive tool. It lets you jump back in time through the blog to read posts and see photos from any month in recent years. So if you click on March of 2018, it takes you to the last article posted on March, say March 30th. And then you can scroll back in time to see how things looked in mid-March or mid-April. Now, the general trend on this graph is what the statisticians call a bell curve. So I've added a symmetrical curve here and made it fit as best it can. And it looks to me like our peak, most popular day for being ice-free is Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. That's the date when the lake seems to be most commonly 100% free of ice. But so far, I've just been thinking about the completion of the thaw. I had only the vague notion that the beginning of the thaw was when Safety Bay opened up, and that it took maybe 6 weeks from then to say goodbye to the last of the ice. And this is where Sean Cockram comes in. Sean was following Ice Patrol from Winnipeg, and he got thinking about how do we define the start of the thaw. And at that time, he had friends in Clearwater Bay, and now he has his own place out there someplace. Anyway, he came to the sensible notion that the thaw truly begins when the daily temperature is mostly above freezing, which seems pretty common sense. But don't forget that the ice gives out in Safety Bay when temperatures are still very cold, and that's because of the current. But to really see action on the lake body in the whole, we need warm temperatures. So he emailed me and got in touch to suggest that the day when the mean daily temperature goes above freezing on a lasting basis, okay? Like this year we had a warm spell, but it didn't stick with us. So we haven't called it inflection date yet. And that let me compile a more sophisticated graph, because now I can think about when did the thaw begin each year, and what kind of a thaw are we having. So this is laid out like a calendar, starting with 2003 at the bottom. I draw a bar for each year that begins when Sean said we hit the inflection date, and the bar ends when the ice is all gone. And you can see that the 6-week theory was completely bogus, and that the springs vary enormously. Our most recent spring last year is one of the longest bars on the graph. We had warm temperatures commencing in early March, but March is March, and it didn't last. We had strange cold snaps, and temperature hovered around freezing, so we never quite retracted that May the 4th claim, but it was a very slow start to the thaw and a very long thaw. On this metric, there are some thaws as fast as 3 weeks and as slow as 8. Generally, the longer bars are on the left, because if the thaw starts early, it's bound to falter in March cold spells. If spring hangs fire until later, like this year, the ice is more likely to go faster, because we're going to hit April's warmer weather. Now, we talked about the inflection date, and here we are at April the 9th. And you'll see several years on here where the inflection date was April the 7th. And most of them we managed to be ice-free by early May or mid-May, early May, and so on. But we haven't hit the inflection date yet. We're going to be nice and warm for a day or two, and then we're heading back into the cold, and we're supposed to get more snow, and that's not going to help. So in 2016, I got my next big advance, I guess, when someone gave me a nudge towards satellite photography. It shows more, and it also, and besides covering the whole lake, there are false color versions. We'll get into that in a moment. This is a very nice picture from the European Space Agency's Sentinel 2 satellite. And it's a little dark from where I'm standing. I don't know how visible it is for you. But Kenora is up here. And then this would be Northern Harbor and Pine Portage Bay, I think. This is some of the last ice on the lake, and it is pinned right in between Heenan Point and Needle Point. And it actually just formed kind of a log jam there. Now, this photograph is just a tiny part, of a picture that covered the whole lake, 62 megapixels, far beyond the limit of what I can put on my website. I can only load about 3 gigabyte images or something. And that picture was huge. But the thing about the Sentinel satellites is they don't come our way very often. And when they do, they don't photograph the whole lake. They work in narrow strips. They have high-resolution cameras that scan a small swath of the Earth's surface in high resolution. So a lot of times we'll get a picture and it might include some narrows but not the main part of the lake. Or it might include Shoal Lake, but it doesn't include the middle. And there's not much we can do about that. The satellite has other priorities. But NASA has a pair of satellites that swing by every day. Now, Terra and Aqua are matching satellites with identical cameras. The MODIS cameras, that stands for Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer cameras, take images every day. And they're compiled by Liam Gumley at the University of Wisconsin-Madison into large composites that span most of the USA and parts of Canada, including our part. Now, the image comes in 2 flavors. True color, like this one, in which the open water looks black and the ice looks white. For these shots, only the visible light seen by the MODIS cameras is used. Contrast between ice and cloud is poor. And the difference between lake water and the dark forests is also hard to distinguish. So, this is the identical shot in the false color version. Liam adds a measure of what the camera can see in infrared. Now, this version is actually optimized for studying plant growth and agriculture, and it also sheds new light on ice, because now the ice is blue. This is ice. And distinct from cloud, which you can see all over down here, little summer cumulus clouds. And the forest goes bright green, assuming that the snow is out of the woods, making the outlines of the lakes very sharp. But the resolution, moderate resolution imaging spectrophotometer, right, maxes out at 1 pixel for every 250 square meters. So you are not going to see your cottage. In fact, you're not even going to see Kenora. But with practice, a trained eye can usually find Rabbit Lake. There's Longbow. And somewhere up here is Rabbit Lake, and then these are the black sturgeons and so on. So you can see something of what's going on. And in this picture, it just happens that the main body of the lake is pretty much ice-free. And we have this bunch of ice near town, just past Hay Island and stuff. And south of the barriers, this is always a holdout. And we have ice on Shoal Lake, which again is another place that tends to go late. So what can we do with these low resolution pictures? Well, I put them on the website. I use this portion here in the red box. And I usually add flags to it. The red box is just 640 pixels by 640 pixels. So if this was, 1995 and we were using 14-inch monitors, it would look great. But it doesn't look so good on a big monitor or a big screen. But at least it tells the story. So let's take what we learned from the pancake graph about the duration of our springs and go hunting through the MODIS archives. They keep everything online, and you can do it yourself at home. I do most of the work, but you can go from a link on Ice Patrol to the MODIS photographs, and they have them listed in chronological order, reverse chronological order, with the newest pictures at the top of the list. So you can actually go back and say, Boy, this reminds me of 2018. We should go look. So, what do we get when we look back at historical pictures of this part of the world? This is a collection of photographs from Modus cameras that were all taken within a day or two of the end of March. Average, I think, is March 27th, for several years to show the difference that we face. We weren't kidding when we said all springs are not created equal. So 2012, in the top left, was one of our early melts. It's the one I use as a reference when I think things are going well. 2014 was the miserable year when Ice Patrol became a website, and it's dreadful. There's so much snow in the woods that you can barely make out the outline of the lake, even in false color. 2017 shows some open water at Rainy River and at Big Narrows, and, sorry, Big Narrows is up here, and the Winnipeg River, of course, which is always an early opener. And more interestingly, from a prediction point of view, the farmland is bare down on the American side of the lake. And that means that the snow is gone from open areas and things are melting quite well that year. Now, 2018 was not a good year, and you can see it's quite snowy again. 2021 shows much less snow, and the fall was over by April 24th that year. We're not doing that this year. This year, in this corner, is a close match out of all the pictures I was able to find from the end of March to 2018. They've got the same thing going on with the farms just starting to surface, and you've got about the same thing going on with some open water in the headwaters of the Winnipeg River and a bit of softening at Big Narrows. Now this is, now over a week ago, but that was my first indication this year that we're going to have a thaw that at least starts like 2018. And if we go back to the pancake graph, you'll see that 2018 was not a great year. Now, Sean Cockram, the guy that provided me with the data to do those simple charts, also does his own charts. And what he does, after he sends them, well, he sends them to me, but one of the ways he looks at things is to see how cold the winter got, to get an idea of the likely thickness of ice. Rather than going out and trying to drill it and allow for current and water flow and lake levels, we just simplify and we say, it was a long, cold winter, we're going to have a lot of ice. So he uses what he calls the Cumulative Freezing Index. And this year is the bold dashed line, because he sent me this version to talk about this year. So what he does for a Cumulative Freezing Index, when the mean daily temperature, roughly halfway between the high and the low, falls below freezing in late autumn, he starts tracking it. And he starts plotting a downward line. So if the mean daily temperature on a given day is -5, the line drops 5 points. And if the next day the mean daily temperature is -8, the line drops a further 8 points. So naturally, the line drops pretty steeply in January and February. All of the winters drop steeply because we get lots of cold weather in January and February. And then things start to ease up in March. By that time, we've accumulated a score of between 1,000 and 2,500 freezing points. And the worse it is, the more heat it's going to take to melt it all. And if we take a look at the long-term forecast, we can even take a guess as to how long that might take. So this little kick here at the recent time span at the end of this graph is our little warm spell from earlier in March. We actually got above freezing for several days in a row. But the bad news on this graph is that 2022 or 21-22 winter is the second worst year on the graph, exceeded only by 2014, our miserable example. Now another graph that Sean draws for us, I call the shark fin graph. The upward fins are summers, and we don't pay a lot of attention to them. And then when the temperature goes below freezing, the mean daily temperature drops below freezing, he says, okay, summer's over, we'll start freezing. and he starts tracking. This is the same line you saw before, spread out, but now compressed so that we can have all our winters together. And what you can see from this is that a long winter makes a wide spike, and a cold winter makes a deep spike. So here we are again, and we are the second coldest winter on the graph. So what we look for is the inflection point. So the inflection point is the blue X. So this is the point where the temperature, the mean daily temperature, goes above freezing for keeps. And then this tiny little bit here between that and ice out, marked by the red circle, that's Ice Patrol's annual existence. And we haven't hit the inflection point yet. And we may not hit it this week, because although we're going to have a couple of warm days now, we're also going to have some snow, which won't help, and we're going to have a cold snap heading into the Easter weekend. All right, so when I say there's no more ice, that's when the red dot appears, and then we close down the website for another year. So as I prepared this slideshow last week, we hadn't hit the inflection date, and look, here we are, and we still haven't. So a lot is going to depend on our spring weather. Heat, wind, and sunshine are all good, but there are a number of wild cards, and the forecast, especially the long-term forecast, can't predict them all. Spring rain can help speed up the thaw by removing snow cover. We just saw that. And of course, late snowfall or cold snap makes things worse, and we're about to see that. But we will get there eventually. And this is what the last of the lake ice looks like. Remember I said that south of the Barrier Islands, these are the Barrier Islands, and this is the last patch of ice on the lake, 1 year, not this year. And Shoal Lake is actually visible up in the top corner, and it's frozen. That's quite common. It has been known to go first, but not usually. And in the end, we can't do anything to speed the thaw up. All we can do is keep an eye on it, and that's what Lake of the Woods Ice Patrol does. And this is just because it's pretty. And I get to see stuff, or got to, when I was flying, I got to see stuff like this all the time. So, question time. Does anybody have a question about the Ice Patrol website, or the thaw, or